Okay, here we are at section 1.6 of our textbook where we're going to talk about Spanglish, probably a term you're all familiar with, but in case you aren't, Spanglish is a blended word of Spanish and English. Hopefully you've watched this video that I provided for you in Canvas before you came to this lecture, but for those of you that speak Spanglish, it probably hit really close to home. This topic usually really does for those that actually are able to successfully use Spanglish. So we're going to talk about what Spanglish is, some of the social issues with it, as well as how to know if you're a Spanglish speaker. Is it bad Spanish or bad English, or is it a demonstration of success in both languages? So let's explore that very quickly. We have to also talk about language attitudes when we talk about Spanglish. So if you could guess, what would be some of the attitudes that people might have about Spanglish in our society? Typically, what I get is that most people, whether they speak it or not, it's not necessarily their opinion, but they've heard that it's considered bad Spanish or bad English, right? It's usually seen as, well, if you're using Spanglish, it's because you're not good at either language, right? You're struggling in English and Spanish, so you have to use both languages because you can't create the space to master one language. Some people say it's somewhat acceptable. But it depends who you're using it with, and you have to be careful with who you use it. So typically the language attitudes about Spanglish are typically negative. The only people who have negative attitudes about Spanglish are those who don't know how to do it. Everyone in this class, if you speak Spanish and English that uses Spanglish, you don't think poorly of it. In fact, it's actually quite useful for you, and it leads to a lot of successful communication and a lot of group membership because it is a specific way of communicating. I also want to add that those who typically think it is bad, that think Spanglish is bad, are typically people who can't speak both languages. For the most part, that's not always true, but for the most part, if you come across someone who thinks Spanglish is lazy English or lazy Spanish, it's because they themselves are monolingual. Maybe they only speak Spanish or only speak English. I'm talking about being fluent in both languages. If they are not fluent in both languages, then they don't have the social understanding of how useful it is. So typically what you find is those that don't like it aren't fluent necessarily in both languages and haven't been able to properly use it. Okay, so Spanglish, what is it exactly? Well, it's not its own language. It's the use of two independent languages. We have Spanish and English being used simultaneously, and it's a very common practice in bilingual societies. So you have to imagine when we went over the history of English, when there was French and Old English in the same society, you probably had code switchers or people there using a Frenchlish, or I don't know what they would have called it, right? Spanglish is a unique title. But they're in a bilingual society where you have two languages, you will have speakers, if they're fluent in both languages, use a hybrid of the two. But it's not its own language. It's literally using two languages at once. So Spanglish, where'd that name come from? Well, it's not a linguistic term, it's a folk linguistic term, meaning society created it, okay? It has no precise meaning, no linguistic meaning. It's just we create words all the time in society, and Spanglish is talking about someone who's using Spanish and English in the same conversation. An important point to make about it is that it's not stable, okay? There aren't rules that govern it. Which is one reason it's not a language, and it varies quite a bit. The Spanglish used in California is different than the Spanglish used in Texas. So you could say, well, yeah, then there's just different dialects of Spanglish, but it's more complicated than that because it's not about dialects, it's that there aren't any rules that apply to Spanglish. So what Spanglish is or isn't means different things to different people. Again, some people find Spanglish as a useful tool, and some people have negative linguistic attitudes towards it. You can think of it as style shifting, right? Shifting between style and the way you speak. But it's not so much that. We call it code switching because, and code meaning language. So language switching, you literally are switching languages in the middle of a conversation. It's not the same as me talking to you in English and then me turning to my child and talking in Spanish and then coming back to you and talking in English. That's not code switching. Code switching is when I'm talking to you and I go between the two languages in the same conversation with you. So that's what code switching is. If you come across studies with it, that's what they're talking about. There are different types of code switching. I do not speak Spanish, so I'm not going to read the Spanish from the screen. The meaning of the sentence is not necessarily important, but we can still demonstrate these types of code switching without being fluent in Spanish, though I wish I was. But we have different types of code switching, meaning we have different ways that people switch between the two languages. The first is called a lexical insertion. If you remember the word lexicon, lexical, that means word. So lexicon means the words in your head. Lexical means word. So when we say lexical insertion, we're saying word insertion. They're putting a word in there. So the top sentence is an example of a primarily Spanish sentence with a lexical insertion of an English word sporadically in the sentence. So it's primarily a Spanish conversation, but we're inserting maybe a few English words. And it can work the other way around. It can be primarily an English conversation with an insertion of a Spanish word here and there. The question becomes, well, why do they do this? I say they because I'm not a Spanglish speaker, but why would a bilingual person do this? Well, there's a couple reasons. One could be that the word doesn't exist in the one language. So let's say the word picky did not exist in Spanish, then we might use the English word because that's the word for it. Or it could be that maybe for a minute you've forgotten what the Spanish word is. So you would reach for the English word because it's the closest to your brain in your lexicon, right? You've got this lexicon operating between two full languages and you're sorting it, so you're going to reach for the word that's the closest to it. So let me clarify again. We had lexical insertion where maybe I'm just going to insert a word because maybe it's the first one that comes to mind. So I'm speaking Spanish. I can't think of the Spanish word for picky, but I remember the English word is this, so I'm going to use it. Okay. And I want to clarify something I just said. That's a little different than lexical borrowing, which is the other thing I said, which is when there might not be a word for it in that language, so you have to use the other language's word, such as the word email. At one point, that was an English word, right? So when email entered Hispanic communities, the concept of emailing, there wasn't maybe a Spanish word for it. There might be now, but at one point there wasn't. And so they would grab for the English word. And this works the other way. Maybe they're speaking English and there isn't an English word for something, like let's say salsa. We're going to get to that word in a second, but that's not an English word. That's a word we use now in English, but it wasn't always an English word. So they would borrow it from Spanish real quick to throw it into their English sentence, right? And that's called lexical borrowing. When we're taking a word from another language that doesn't exist in the first language, right? So we're borrowing a word. It's kind of a misnomer because when you borrow something, you give it back, and we're not giving the word back, but we're taking words from other languages because maybe we don't have the word for it. This is very common, lexical insertions, and the beautiful thing about it is this is how words move around between languages, okay? We have a lot of words you saw from our history that come from French, that come from Greek, because they were borrowed from those languages and put into ours, possibly because English didn't have a word for it, okay? So here's some common examples of lexical insertions that have happened over the time that are being used a little more and more by English speakers because we've heard it used by Spanglish speakers, and so we've started using it. So picante, loco, fiesta, macho, these are words now that you can start seeing in our English language because of Spanglish speakers. And it goes from the point where it's been inserted into, they're using, Spanglish speaker might be using this as an insertion, right? So there wasn't a word for, maybe there wasn't a word for, well, nachos is a great example. Nachos is a Spanish word. There's not a word for nachos in English. So if a Spanish speaker, they're speaking in English, and they're going for the word nachos, there's no English equivalent for it. So they will lexically insert the Spanish word nacho into their conversation, right? So they've code switched. But that word has been used so often that even a monolingual English speaker like me knows what it means, and I'm using the Spanish word to communicate that. Some of this lexical insertion has happened so much that we've just taken the whole word in English, right? We just accept in our English language. Some of these words right here, you might not know are Spanish words that we regard as English because we don't know any better, or we don't know any, not better, we don't know any different, right? We don't know the origin, the etymology of the word. So there's some additional, we talked about lexical insertion, lexical borrowing. There's a couple other types of code switching that we can do. There's intra-sentential, okay? So that's when we're going to put it in the middle of a sentence. So if you look at that first example there, we start with Spanish and the sentence ends with English. The next sentence starts with English and then in the middle you see another English word, and at the end you see. So this is called when we inside the sentence we're making the change, okay? So it's not a full sentence in Spanish and then a full sentence in English. It is in the middle of the sentence we're switching between the two languages. So that's intra-sentence, intra-sentential. Then we have inter-sentential and sentential. I think I'm saying that word wrong, but it means sentence, okay? And this is unlike the last one, where we're switching in the middle of the sentence. This is when we are switching languages after each sentence. So if you notice in that example right there, we start with Spanish for a sentence. The next two sentences happen to be in English, and the final sentence happens to be in Spanish. So this is when we're switching the language every sentence. And these are choices Spanglish speakers make for whatever reason that's motivating it. These are the patterns we've observed in research of what code switching manifests as. So the question is, can Spanglish ever be recognized as an official language? Okay, why can't it? It's got a name. Can we ever recognize it as an official language? And there's two reasons why it's not recognized as an official language. And this takes us back to our prior lecture on, I think it was axiom number 3, that all languages are structured and rule governed. We know that. Spanglish is not. There are no rules in terms of which words we borrow from which language. So if in the Spanglish society, they're going to decide that we will always use the Spanish word loco instead of the English word crazy, and that is our rule, and they start developing rules like that, it can then meet the criteria of being a language. But there's no consistency in terms of the code switching and what language you're allowed to use what word from, okay? It's all a little arbitrarily done by the speakers in that conversation. The other thing for a language to be recognized as a language is it needs to be politically recognized. If you remember our history of English, English was not recognized as a language until the French left and we finally established a parliament and made it our official language. It had existed for hundreds of years before it got to be recognized as a language. It already existed, but it wasn't recognized. And it takes that political recognition. So you would basically need all the Spanglish speakers to stand up in unison and say, we are a language, here is our rule book, here's our structure, and someone needs to run for an office and implement it, basically. So it's a little more complicated to make it an official language, but those are some of the reasons it's not recognized as a language. The main thing we want to drive home on Spanglish is this. Or on code switching in general, because again, we have Spanglish in this country, but in other countries, there's different bilinguals. Code switching might look different. It's different languages. In order to be a code switcher, or specifically in this situation, in order to be a Spanglish speaker, you have to be bilingually competent in both languages. You can. It actually is something that requires fluency in both languages to be able to do well. Okay, and there's a reason for that, and I'm going to try to explain a little bit of grammar to you that you don't necessarily have to memorize, but hopefully it can make sense. So let's look at the English sentence. It's the second line. I really hope you go to the concert with us, or I really hope that you go to the concert with us. Okay, so in this English sentence, we have two clauses. We're going to learn about clauses and syntax, but let me explain this sentence to you so that you can follow this point I'm making. A main clause is a part of a sentence that can function by itself. So I can say, I really hope. I really hope. That's a sentence. I don't have to follow it with anything, right? It's called a main clause. It could be its own sentence, right? But I also have a subordinate clause, and that's one that relies on a main clause. So the second part of that sentence is, that you go to the concert with us, or you go to the concert with us. I can never just say, you go to the concert with us, or that you go to the concert with us, without you being curious about more information, because you recognize I'm missing something. What's missing is the main clause. You have to have a main clause in every sentence. So in this case, we have, I really hope that you go to the concert with us. we've got our main clause, I really hope, and our subordinate clause, that you go to the concert with us. Okay, this is important to recognize, even if you can't follow the terminology. It's important to recognize those fundamentals because in order, if we go to the Spanish version, let's look at the code switching line up above. I really hope, and then I don't want to read it. You guys are going to laugh at me. Then the rest of the sentence in Spanish. A literal translation of that is, I really hope that you go to the concert with us. Okay, so that's what the translation is. But notice how the beginning of the sentence is English and the second part is Spanish. Okay. Specifically, the main clause happens to be in English and the subordinate clause happens to be in Spanish. Okay. The code switcher specifically knew that if I am going to code switch in this sentence, I need to cut it off at the clause. I cannot say, I really, and then switch to Spanish. Okay. You will notice that code switchers, they might do the lexical insertion with one word, but then every time, if they're doing parts of a sentence, they're code switching at a clause, okay, at these different chunks that make up a sentence. And in order to be able to do that, you have to understand how clauses work in English and clauses work in Spanish. You might not have a mental, like you might not be able to take a grammar quiz on it, but because you guys are fluent in English, you understand, I really hope that you go to the concert with us, okay? You have to be fluent in Spanish as well to be able to code switch that and cut it off at the clause. You've got to be fluent in both languages to be able to do that. So I hope that made sense, but I just wanted to use that example to reiterate that Spanglish actually is linguistic competence and fluency in 2 languages. It's a real powerful tool. That wraps up our quick lecture on Spanglish. Go ahead and move on to section 1.7.